Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all okay. Excuse me. I have a good friend in the parish who gets the Irish Independent newspaper every day and kindly lets me have it when he's read it. It's always good to discover what's happening in your home country, and I appreciate Bernard's gesture very much. I now feel I'm more in touch with the political, social, sporting and religious landscape of Ireland, and often, sadly, it is not a pretty read. In addition, on Mondays, the Sunday World newspaper arrives. It is a tabloid read by very many people, with its sensational revelations of this and that, which seem to hold an enduring fascination for them. The previous English versions of this sort of publication used to be advertised by the words, "All life is here," which is not really true, only the salacious bits of it. In this case, nearly every page is filled with the accounts of gang warfare that has blighted Ireland for some years. There are stories of drug smuggling, gangland murder, untold violence and greed among the families, which would probably make the mafia look like friends who just had a little tiff. Here is sin writ large and embellished to satisfy the spurious appetites of readers. So right in the midst of this Sunday World, with its graphic accounts of wanton violence and murder and truly awful headlines, two weekly columns appear by no less people than Daniel O'Donnell and Father Brian Darcy. Father Brian, whom I've quoted to you frequently, justifies his 40-year spell with the paper, which has got him suspended more than once by his Passionist order and incurred the displeasure of many bishops, by saying that this is what the majority of Irish people read, and this is where the gospel message belongs, right in the middle of all this sin. He's certainly got a point. And last week we began to talk about sin and how this experience, which we sadly are all too familiar with, was presented to us at the beginning of the Bible. Looking at the context of those stories and their purpose gave us an insight into how this experience affected us as human beings and still does. The Bible, for all its inconsistencies and improbabilities, is in fact quite a torrid document, detailing the development and extent of sin through the ages. And certainly the adage of "all life is here" could be said of it here. If you were to read the Bible from start to finish, you would discover that it is one of the most violent, salacious, and thoroughly rotten books imaginable, which would make the Sunday World and its contemporaries look like a Sunday parish mass sheet. Maybe, after watching this talk, you might find yourself rushing to the bookshelves, dusting down your old copy and searching avidly for the juicy bits. You will not have to look too closely, but I would appreciate it if you could manage to contain yourselves and your curiosity until after you've listened to me today. The history of salvation, which we spoke about last time, the history of God's working among his people, is a catalogue of events which follow a familiar pattern: sin, punishment, and forgiveness. The second chance of early church practice found its origin here, with God continually giving second chances to his people, who not only repeatedly apostatized, that is, denied their faith in him, but did so often in the most heinous and gruesome manner. Sin was not as such individual acts of wickedness, but a deep sense of alienation from God and his goodness, which expressed itself in these actions and crimes, rather in a similar way to the opposite, where good deeds, which are of little consequence in themselves, but only as an expression of a personal life of love and honour of God, which expresses himself, even bursts out, if you like, in this manner. All of this is detailed graphically in the pages of the Bible, and if we reflect carefully on it, can be seen to be very modern indeed, since human beings now are the same as they've always been, sinners. Looking at sin in a more considered and psychological way than simply enumerating how many times you've lied, stolen, or disobeyed someone will help us to understand ourselves even better, and to see features of our character which we may not previously have recognized or even denied, and where, as a consequence, the need for some sort of redemption or salvation arises. The experience of sin is very powerful, as we've said. Sometimes in the past it was described as missing the mark, but this cannot adequately express the deep, even desperate emotion that it causes within us. We've noted the expressions of St. James and St. Paul from the New Testament, who clearly understood the destructive power of this experience, which somehow took you away from your true self, thus creating a tension between what you are and what you would like to be, and cause you to say or do things you could not previously have contemplated and feel awful about it as a result. Think for a moment about the great passions of the human spirit, which we cannot ourselves create or control. There are, of course, love, joy, excitement, and all those positive things that make our lives worth living, but also the huge negative emotions of darkness, resentment, envy, jealousy, lust, desire for control or power over another, anger, viciousness, and many others which are of their very nature diminishing and often ultimately destructive. You will find them graphically expressed, as we said, in the pages of Shakespeare and many dramatists, poets, musical composers of the operatic or more popular kind from the earliest times, and of course in the good old Ten Commandments in those early books of the Bible. We do not like to own up to this, both personally and institutionally, and this has caused us to deny the truth, which again we see in the Bible. I do not know the man, said St. Peter. Sometimes we blame someone else. It was the woman you put with me, said Adam. Or become culpably blind to what we or others are doing. Think of the story of the rich man who did not even see the poor man Lazarus at his door. And all this has given rise to what we now call alternative facts or fake news, as we've said already, by which we simply don't accept or see the truth of what we've done and been. Then there is expediency. It is better for one man to die for the sake of the people, as Pilate excused himself. And we now call that collateral damage, an expression coined by the Americans during the Vietnam War to excuse all sorts of barbaric acts whereby innocent people were maimed and killed in order for what was perceived to be the greater objective to be achieved. Such practice goes back much further in history than the Far Eastern wars of the 1960s and 70s. It was used to justify the slave trade, the Crusades of the medieval period, and even the Holocaust, which also gave rise to another terrifying feature, the fact that evil is often banal and possibly apparently civilized. Many years ago, there was a brilliant TV documentary, a drama documentary, about a Schloss somewhere in Bavaria in the 1940s, where a group of German generals met for the weekend and over lavish banquets, cigars and brandy, coolly and professionally looked at drawings, considering the quality of the buildings, the input and output features, and the need for creation of a disposal facility. They were, in fact, planning the construction of the ovens for the concentration camps in a manner that seemed totally detached from the evil they were seeking to bring about. When questioned about this later at the Nuremberg trials, they justified these heinous crimes by claiming their innocence, saying they were only carrying out orders and that the Jewish people were not really people anyway. Such rationale has often been used to justify genocide in places elsewhere, like Rwanda, Syria, and the former Yugoslavia. And it's a great irony to me, personally, that the very same rationale is used still today to justify what, in my estimation, is a crime far greater than the Holocaust, which still continues after 54 years in what is perceived to be the most civilized manner in countless hospital wards up and down the country, namely the legalized murder of over 7 million unborn children, who are similarly classified as not really people, even though this practice can take place right up to the time of their birth. One day later, if the child was born dead, huge efforts are made to console its parents and offer bereavement counselling. And this, to me, is one of the greatest sins of the modern era and is totally inconsistent with the remit of our wonderful National Health Service, which has done so much over the years, and especially in the last 18 months, to support, protect, and often heal us in the most trying and unprecedented of circumstances. The practice of abortion contains many of the key elements with what we might call institutional sin, namely blindness, denial, and inconsistency. and it remains the biggest blight on this wonderful agency, calling daily into question one of the tenets of its formation, the offering of free health care to all people. The fact that abortion is now classified as health care when it necessarily involves the destruction of human life that all medical professionals are sworn to protect is the biggest hypocrisy of all. And the saddest thing of all is that the blindness and denial of the truth by people you have the right to expect should know better, even some church personnel, who often talk about it in a really rather mealy-mouthed manner as it's being justified in certain cases, and those professionals who like to dress it up by referring to it as a medical procedure. Then there are those who are obsessed with what we now call equality for all, who claim that a woman has rights over her own body and that this supersedes the rights of her unborn child, another human being. Similar visions of inequality are now being applied to asylum seekers, whom we do not want to come here and bring their tragedies with them. For me, as an Irishman, one of the saddest days of my life was the sight of thousands of Irish people outside the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, cheering in celebration on the day that abortion was legalised in their country, at the prospect of being able to take away the lives of their children because it didn't suit them. 90% of abortions are in fact illegal under the terms of the Act, as well as immoral, but we close our eyes to it because they are inconvenient and unwanted. Recently, I spoke to a lady who told me that her daughter had got pregnant, so they had to sort it, as if it were a problem like fixing a tap. And this is what has become of us. Expediency, blindness, and denial now frame our moral behaviour, or lack of it, whether we have any religious faith or not. We've been taken over by sin, and we do not recognise it, because it interferes with how we want to live our lives without any inconvenience or interruption. This is the greatest sin of all, and underpins all others. To be fair, I should also say at this point that recently I baptised the babies of two single mothers who did not choose to get rid of their babies, but to accept the challenge of bringing them up alone with the help of loving, supportive and understanding families. And for this, they deserve our respect and admiration. So the sin described so long ago in the Bible is alive and well in our world today, our country, and within ourselves. Recently, we've seen all over the world senseless bombings, murder and violence, driving people out of their own countries and subjecting them to torture, murder and cruel death. Likewise, recently, 85 women have been brutally murdered by men here since the start of lockdown. Countless incidents of domestic abuse have been recorded, and the use of social media has become the latest and most sophisticated form of control and cruelty. When confronted with this, the perpetrators will deny it vehemently because they cannot even see it, and controlling each other's movements by use of phones and tracking devices seems to be as civilized a way of sin as we've already noted here. This has given rise to the notion of what we might call institutional sin, in which not only the person is committing a crime, if you like to call it that, is seen to be to blame, but also the organisation to which they belong, particularly if that organisation turns a blind eye to it or even denies it to protect its reputation. There are claims that the police force is institutionally racist or misogynist, and there is certainly ample evidence to support that claim. Similarly, the BBC has been repeatedly accused of being institutionally corrupt, and the events in the United States last week surrounding the activities of Facebook and other media organisations have been enlightening and disturbing, as well as the celebrations of Newcastle United supporters who conveniently blind themselves to the fact that their new owners, who are going to pump so much money into the club, are in fact members of a regime that uses torture and murder to progress its policies. For all this, however, which demonstrates clearly that sin as we know it is not simply a personal or individual problem, and that what we've seen in the Bible is still alive and well today, there is one matter for me which is more painful than any other. And if I did not speak to you about it today, that would be most irresponsible and caused you to think that I was guilty of blindness and denial as well. It is where the personal and institutional characteristics of sin for me come sadly together. Last week, it was revealed in France that over a 70-year period, 260,000 children were abused by priests or members of religious congregations, male or female. While it was not specified what form this abuse had taken, there is no doubt that some of it was of the most heinous kind. This is the latest in a catalogue of shame, which has made me remove my clerical garb, write a song to describe my feelings, and rack my brain as to how we can ever rebuild this church of ours, which has failed its people so badly for so long. Of course, the church has always been sinful. It is made up of sinners like you and me, and we are glad to found a home here. And it has been from the very beginning, when there were fights and rows and fallings out, as you can see from the Gospel, the Acts of the Apostles, and the letters of the Apostles. There has been 2,000 years and more of a history of sinful behaviour by those in authority, even popes, crusading violence, and many other examples of the control of people's lives, abuse of power, and lust for it. But this is different, even though it is part of the same thing, sin. It has been accompanied by blindness and denial, as in all the matters we've spoken of today, and has caused so much harm in making people suspicious, wrecking lives of victims, as well as those unjustly accused of abusing them, and created a climate of nastiness, indifference, and shame, to the point that very many people have walked away from this church in which they believed never to return again. All that people have the right to expect from the Lord's church as an institution, truth, kindness, compassion, forgiveness, and love, have all but disappeared, except in some quarters, and not just disappointed us, but even crushed us. I am your priest. I love you. I have never sought your approval or respect, just as well. And like all human beings entrusted with huge responsibilities, I too make mistakes. I can be grumpy, unthinking, blind to my own faults and many things. In fact, I made a huge mistake only last night at the Derby Tuesday Club because of my insensitivity and thoughtlessness, and have just written a letter to apologise profusely for it. Failure and mistakes are never far away from me. But this abusive attitude to children and vulnerable people has never once crossed my mind or heart, and never will. It is symptomatic of so many awful things in the past, now coming into the present. You have been let down, and worse, patronised and insulted by clergy and bishops. This is not an easy thing to say, but it's true. So when we talk to you from the pulpit about the need for redemption and salvation, we need to remember that there is no one in need of it more than ourselves. We will see next week how the personal experience of sin enslaves and traps us almost like an addiction, and how we need to be freed from it, truly redeemed. But for today, I, your brother and priest and friend, once again humbly ask your forgiveness for the behaviour of so many of my colleagues who have betrayed your trust in this terrible way, blinded themselves and denied the truth of what they have done, and persuaded others to cover it up. In a way, this has been seen as a sin that can never be forgiven. But without your forgiveness, all our attempts to rebuild the church of our Lord in the way he wants, as shown to us so beautifully by Pope Francis, will surely fail, and this church will slowly erode into nothingness. As long as I am alive, I give you my word and my solemn promise that I will continue to work my heart and mind out for you to ensure that this does not ever happen again.